Hello everybody, it's Josie here. I'm going to be talking about one of the books that I read in the month of May, and that book is Sadie by Courtney Summers. So this book, I'm sure everybody's kind of read it by now, but I hadn't, and I kind of wanted to give my thoughts on it because I had a lot of thoughts. So the basic premise of Sadie is it's a thriller. And you've kind of got these kind of twin mysteries or narratives. So you have Sadie, the title character, who has gone missing. And you also hear about Maddie, who is her younger sister, who was killed. And the premise of this book is that you've also got a podcast, so someone who has a podcast who is sort of investigating really Sadie's disappearance, and then you also then find out through this and through Sadie's narrative of what happened to Matty. What I like about this book is that you've got twin narratives, so you've got the actual kind of podcast and almost like the transcript from the podcast. And a lot of people obviously say this is going to be good on audiobook, which I can imagine it is, but I read the physical copy. So you had the kind of podcast, and then you had Sadie's narrative that's written in just normal narrative, but then you've got the other bits that are in sort of this person said this and kind of the interview style of the podcast. And I really love that. I'm a real sucker for podcasts. I'm a real sucker for true crime podcasts, serial, I adore. I read another book not that long ago called Six Voices that was also about a podcast, and that was written pretty much exclusively in podcast as well, which I really liked. And I think if you like Sadie, you'd probably like that. Or if you like that style of podcast in Sadie, you'd probably like that as well. So I would recommend that book. But Sadie, so this is... I read this, I'll be honest, it is a page turner. I read this in just one evening. I couldn't put it down. I wanted to know what happens. So from that perspective, really, really good. It really kept me engaged. I wanted to know. I kind of wanted to know what happened to Sadie, but I also wanted to kind of figure out the other aspects. I would say on the negative side, and the reason to let you know, I gave this book 4 stars. I didn't give it 5 stars because you have these two narratives. So you have Sadie and West, I think is the podcast owner's narrative. And so the podcast is basically trying to uncover what's happened to her. But the thing is, because you're reading Sadie's narrative often first, and then kind of West discovering and relaying what he's discovered and kind of following her. So Sadie kind of goes out to find out or avenge what happened to her sister. You already know what's happened. And then West is kind of finding that out. And I'm not sure how you could have, well, no, I have some ideas of how you could have written it, but I think I would have preferred it being written in such a way that you didn't know that you were finding it out when West was finding out. So quite often when West was relaying, it was like, oh, I found out that Sadie was in X hotel or was in this town. You already know that because you read Sadie's part of the narrative. So I think for me, that kind of element of kind of listening to the podcast in the sense that, oh, I want to know what happens, I want them to tell me what happens, gets lost because you actually already know that because you've read Sadie's narrative. So that's kind of one of the reasons why I docked a star, just because that element of it wasn't there. And also very early on, I kind of guessed and figured out what sort of was going on and possibly what happened to her sister. And why the kind of trip she's making. But other than that, it's written really well. It's certainly the suspense in Sadie's narrative and kind of following her and what she does and who she meets, and that is very, very good. Obviously, if you don't kind of grasp right from the beginning or guess right from the beginning what the driver behind it is, that's really good as well. I would say there are a few trigger warnings for sexual assault, not really very, very bad, but there is a trigger warning for that. The other thing I would say is that there isn't a romance in this, which is good. There is sort of 2 moments, and what I would say is that the other thing, and maybe I was just reading the wrong reviews, but people kept billing this also as a queer character. So what's great about Sadie is she essentially has a disability. She has a stutter, which I think is a great kind of representation. You don't see that much in books, and the way it's written on the page as well. So you have the fact that she stutters. But there was also a lot of people who said that there was kind of a queer element. I sort of get what they're saying, but if you're picking this book up for that, no, there really isn't. There's like one moment in the entire book that could kind of be perceived, but I wouldn't pick it up for that. What I would pick it up for is kind of that thriller aspect. That podcast aspect is really cool. Kind of following along with Sadie to see what happens. I always love that idea of secrets and lies and what lies beneath, and perception of people. I think that's really good. The idea that we see people in one way and actually they might be something totally different. And I love Sadie as a protagonist. I think she's tough. I think she's interesting. I think she's complicated, and she's driven by various motives. But I liked reading about her. I liked her as a character. You may not necessarily find her likable, but I did. She's not likable as an acute likable character. I liked her toughness. I liked her grit. I liked her drive, and the fact that she wanted to get vengeance, I guess, for her sister. So I really like this book. 4 stars. Like I said, the only reason it's not 5 is because of that element that I just felt the podcast wasn't suspenseful because you knew what was happening. So that's why it wasn't a 5-star read for me, but I would still absolutely recommend it. And like I said, if you're interested in that kind of podcast element, check out 6 Voices, because that's really good as well. It's also about a murder or a death that happened, and then it kind of gets investigated. And actually that one gets investigated through the narrative of the podcast. So like I said, if you enjoy that element, definitely read 6 Stories. But yeah, recommend Sadie. Enjoyed it. Understand why people love it. Great book all around. So thank you. Let me know what you thought if you've read Sadie. And again, give me some recommendations of kind of podcast style books. I'd love that. Podcast style thrillers, or any thrillers that you think are good. And I will speak to you all again very soon. Bye-bye.